we see here that the passage is quite lengthy, but analyzing the passage reveals to us that it has two major parts. The primary subject is Pierre Bourdieu's essay, The Field of Cultural Production. It talks about the publishing industry, and what it says is that this essay depicts the publishing industry as a space of literary or artistic position taking, also called the field of struggles, which is defined by the tension and movement inherent among the various positions in the field. Then this is further substantiated. The next part talks about the implementation of this idea on the writers and the authors and the editors in this particular field. It starts here. In particular, for the writer, their authorship is in their work makes their work part of their identity, and there is much at stake personally over negotiation of authority over that identity. However, it is the editor who has the power to impose the dominant definition of the writer and therefore to delimit the population of those entitled to take part in the struggle to define the writer. So an ideal summary should cover both of these aspects. When we look at the options, we realize that option A seems to be the correct answer, but it's not. Option A at least maintains the original subject, Bourdieu's essay, while B says Bourdieu is of the opinion. So it doesn't talk about the essay, but rather it talks about Bourdieu himself. C tells us, C and D tell us, they start the option by stating the field of publishing, which is different. So B, C, and D all change the primary subject. But we realize, despite that, B is the correct answer because it gives us a somewhat limited summary, but a decent summary. It's at least correct. Options A, C, and D, all of them, they distort the premise in one way or another. Let's see why. Option A says, Bourdieu's essay, The Field of Cultural Production, depicts the publishing industry as a space of literary or artistic position taking, also called the field of struggles. If you look at the passage, we realize that this part, the one highlighted here, is an exact restatement, a word for word restatement of this statement, with part of the statement from the passage. And then it says, the second half of this option, due to the power of the publisher to define authorship. Defining authorship is something that we do see over here. It says the power to impose the dominant definition of the writer, defining authorship, therefore to delimit the population of those entitled to take part in the struggle to define the writer. Both of these, in simplification, talk about the power to define authorship. But this distorts the premise, first off, in the phrase due to. Bourdieu's essay depicts the publishing industry as a space of literary or artistic position taking, also called the field of struggles, due to the power of. That is incorrect. We see that this is the implementation of this idea. It's not something which is dependent on this idea. Due to the power is an aspect that we don't see justified by the passage. Then again, it says the power of the publisher to define authorship. That is incorrect. The power rests in the hands of the editor, not the publisher. We see the publishers mentioned here as cultural investors. Publishers rely on the editor position to identify a good investment. So the two positions mentioned here, the publisher and the editor, they are different positions. Publishers rely on the editor. So we cannot say that the power of the publisher to define authorship, it is the editor who has the power to define authorship. So this is distorted. We can eliminate option A. Option B says, Bourdieu is of the opinion. So we realize that it changes the primary subject slightly. But this can be inferred. It's not ideal to have inferences in a summary. A summary should ideally not have inferences. So this is not the perfect option, but it is the only possible option, only potentially correct answer. So Bourdieu is of the opinion that while authors feel that their creations belong to them and their character is defined by them, the editor has the absolute power to define the identity of authors and their work. So this actually covers only the second part of the premise as we have identified. While changing the primary subject from the first part, it omits the entire first half, depicts the publishing industry, etc., etc. But it is still at least close to correct. So Bourdieu is of the opinion, when Bourdieu writes all of these things in his essay, we can infer that Bourdieu is of this opinion. That's why he writes it. Authors feel their creation belong to them, that their creations belong to them, and their character is defined by them, but the editor has the absolute power to define the identity of the authors. This covers these two aspects. Writers, their authorship, their work, in their work makes their work part of their identity, and there's much at stake personally over the negotiation of authority over that identity. However, it is the editor who has the power to impose the dominant definition of the writer. So we find that while this takes only a small part of the passage into consideration, it gets the summarization of that part correctly. So B is a decent choice. Now let's not qualify it just yet, because we've seen that B has problems. First off, B changes the primary subject slightly to an inferential level, but it does change the subject. Second, it omits the entire first half of the argument. So it is limited as well. Option C tells us the field of publishing. So this makes the same mistake that B does. It changes the primary subject, is identified as the field of struggles or the field of position taking, and thus Bourdieu mentions that the self of the author depends upon the publisher's discretion in hiding the inadequacies. We see that the later half of this option is quite distorted. So after is identified as the field of struggles or the field of position taking, this can be connected to the first part, and thus Bourdieu mentions. And thus Bourdieu mentions is also incorrect. It is not a derivation. The later part, the second part, is not a derivation from the first part. So thus Bourdieu mentions is incorrect. Also, that the self of the author depends upon the publisher's discretion. Yet again, the publisher, not the editor. It is the editor who has the power. So this is also incorrect. And then it says in hiding the inadequacies. What inadequacies are we talking about? There's no reference to any inadequacies in the passage. The editor, not the publisher, holds the power to define the authorship of a work. So C is quite inferior. We can eliminate C. Option D says the field of publishing, again a change of subject, is likened to the field of struggles. Already this is incorrect. It is also called the field of struggles. It is not compared, not likened to the field of struggles. And thus it is a line mired by dissatisfaction on the part of authors, as largely their work becomes inadequate due to the lack of identifying with it. The later part of this is a complete assumption. Thus, it is a line mired by dissatisfaction. Where do we have the aspect of dissatisfaction in the given passage? On the part of authors, as largely their work becomes inadequate. Work becomes inadequate. Where is the aspect of inadequacy? Due to the lack of identifying with it. So the lack of identifying with their work, it makes their work, the authors' work, inadequate, and it causes authors to be dissatisfied. No such references have been made in the passage. So this brings in outside information which is not supported by the passage. So D can be eliminated, which means that while it has problems, B is still the only potential choice. Thus the correct answer is B.